Welcome. In this session, I'm going to explain how a two-stroke carburetor works with a single point adjuster. So this adjuster here, this is the mixture screw, and this of course allows us to alter the fuel to air mixture going into the engine. And if you notice, the carburetor itself, it's slightly different in shape to the average carburetor. Taking a bit of a closer look at the bottom here, this is where most things are happening. If we look a little closer, we can see there that we've got the metering system there, and then attached directly above it is the fuel pump system. And that's quite different to some of the carburetors we find on two-strokes. If we look at this one here, this is more of a conventional type of two-stroke carburetor. And you can see there it's very, very different. For a start, we've got the metering system here at the bottom on one side, and its fuel pump system is directly opposite here above. So it's quite different in structure. And as well as that, this particular carburetor has two fuel to air mixture screw adjustments there for the ratios of fuel to air, and this is the type of carburetor we normally see on our two strokes. So coming back to our carburetor then, you can see it's much longer, much different altogether in structure. Notably, of course, on this one we've got the primer bulb there, and I'm going to go through how that works as well. But in order for me to show you how it works, we'll have a look inside at the components. Now let's imagine we've got X-ray vision and we could see through the carb body. It would look something like this. Now before I begin to explain its workings, I'll just point out some key areas. This of course is the throttle cable that's connected to the trigger, the throttle trigger on the machine. And this is the carburetor's throttle lever. And connected to that is the inner part of the throttle cable, which of course moves its position. It moves the lever's position accordingly. And of course, when the lever moves position, it opens up the air hole here, the inlet, to allow air to go into the engine. This is the fuel inlet pipe here. This is where the fuel goes into the carburetor, and then after it's circulated, it comes out of this pipe and back into the fuel tank. So that's the return pipe. Now looking inside the carb at this point, things do look quite complicated, but I'll explain everything in a minute. Now let me simplify this drawing even more so it's more like a schematic diagram. There we go. First of all, let me explain this structure here. This is the equivalent of an inlet butterfly. And what I mean is that it opens and closes, allowing air to go in through the carburetor to the engine. And it's in the shape of a little plastic barrel, so like a cylindrical shape, and it turns this way. And what happens is, when the throttle cable pulls this lever at the top here, and pulls it in the direction of the arrow, what actually happens, it reveals a hole there, so that now air can rush straight through and into the engine. And of course, when the throttle lever is released and the throttle cable allows the throttle lever at the top there to go back to its original place, it closes because it spins back round again. So that's a very simple idea, very basic and simple, but it's effective. It's just a barrel that spins round to reveal a hole. Again, that's quite different from your usual carburetor that you'd normally find on your two-stroke, and that's because in the center there we've got what we call an inlet butterfly, and that basically just flips open and closed to allow air in or blocks the air, and that's all to do with this lever here. This is connected to the throttle cable and it moves its position and opens and closes the butterfly accordingly. Simple as. So back to our carburetor then, and another important structure you wouldn't find on the carburetor I've just shown on your average carburetor is this here. This here is part of the main jet, and that's what allows fuel to come up into the inlet. And you'll see it in its working form very shortly, but I just wanted to go through some of the differences between the two types of carb. Now, in order to explain how this type of carburetor works, I've got to explain how its primer bulb works. That's because the primer bulb system is linked in strongly with the rest of the workings of the whole carburetor. It's all integrated and they couldn't work separately. Let's just imagine now that this is a brand new carburetor and it's fitted to a brand new machine, and we've just put fuel in the fuel tank for the first time, so it's never had any fuel go through this carb at all. So really what we've got in there then is just air. So imagining this as being a brand new carburetor then, on a brand new machine, we'll be wanting to use the primer bulb for the very first time. And it's more than likely that the air hole in the middle there, where the venturi is, will be closed because we won't need to touch that yet. And in order to see things a little clearer, we'll zoom in on this point here so we can see all those workings inside the carb. Okay, that's a little clearer. And of course the primer bulb here we'll now need to press. So let's imagine the end here of the primer bulb is pressed upward towards the carb. Now instantly we can see that the air wants to travel out of the primer bulb and it wants to go through the centre there. Of course the air wants to go through the centre here because we're forcing it upwards through there. The full workings of this rubber valve will become more apparent shortly, but for now the air has forced its way through the centre of it and opened a little one-way valve there at the top. In comparison, if we take a look before we press the primer bulb, we can see there that that valve is shut. And we forced that valve open with air, as you can see now, when the primer bulb was actually pushed. Okay, now air is forced up through the centre and it goes up the fuel lines here and it continues through and all the way across and down out through the return. This pipe here is the return pipe back to the fuel tank, as I mentioned earlier. So basically all we've done at the moment then is we've forced air out of the primer bulb through the fuel lines and out back towards the fuel tank. Now let's let go of the primer bulb and allow it to spring back to its original position. And as it does come back to its original position, a vacuum is created inside there. But air can't come back the way it just went out. It can't come back into the primer bulb. And that's because of this valve here that I mentioned. This one-way valve now, because of that vacuum, has closed shut. And of course air, as I've said, can't come back the way it's just gone out towards the tank in the return pipe. Now because air can't be drawn back this way, because that primer bulb can't suck the air back in basically there, it will need to draw some air in. Otherwise the bulb won't be able to expand. And that's where this rubber valve comes in. Now this rubber valve is a very special valve. As well as having a valve in the centre where I mentioned earlier, it's also got valve flaps here on the side. And it's this area where the air is drawn back into the primer bulb itself. And the way it does that is when suction is created by the primer bulb itself, it draws in air underneath the valve flap, and as it does so, it lifts those valve flaps off their seat, allowing the air to enter the primer bulb. So that air is now coming into the primer bulb, allowing it to expand, but it's creating a vacuum behind it. Up in these fuel lines here, air is travelling down into the primer bulb, and of course that's creating a vacuum, and that vacuum is being felt up above here inside the metering area. And that's because air wants to leave this metering area here in order to go down into the primer bulb, and that of course is creating the vacuum inside of here. Now let's just take a quick look inside of here. This here shown in brown is the metering gasket, and below it here shown in green is the metering diaphragm. And it's these two that are vital at this point. And that's because the metering gasket creates a perfect seal, allowing that vital vacuum that we need, that will become apparent very soon. And it also compartmentalizes that vacuum in order for the metering system to work correctly, as we'll see shortly. And the metering diaphragm is used by that vacuum in order to operate the metering system, and let's take a look how. Well, as we can see by those blue arrows there, we've got air leaving the metering system, and that's building up that vacuum. It draws the metering diaphragm upwards towards the centre there, centre of the metering system. And that's because it's made of a special material that allows the centre of it there to move up and down accordingly as and when there's vacuum up there. When the metering diaphragm is in its expanded state like this area of the metering diaphragm, which is a metal area like a little dowel area which is part of the diaphragm, contacts the back of the metering lever. This forces the back of the metering lever downwards. This allows the metering lever to pivot on its pivot point here and overcome the pressure of the metering spring, whose job it is to keep the metering lever upwards. That pivoting action lifts the front end of the metering lever, and connected to the metering lever is the metering needle. So the metering needle now moves with the metering lever, and it's moved that needle backwards off its airtight seal. The tip of the metering needle is generally made of like an hardened rubber, and when it contacts its seat in its normal position, it creates that airtight seal. But because we've overcome that metering spring and allowed the lever to tilt backwards and lift the front up, it's now opened that seal. And that vacuum pressure from below freely draws down the air from above here down past that open seal and down alongside the metering needle inside this special tube that the metering needle operates through. So that's all being sucked down by the primer bulb, but at the same time the suction pressure lifts a little tiny valve flap that's part of the diaphragm here. This diaphragm is the fuel pump diaphragm, and the little valve flap that exists there is lifted up because of that suction pressure above. And if we take a closer look, we can see that that little valve flap does form part of the fuel pump diaphragm itself. It's also known as a reed valve. It's basically a one-way valve which is made of the same material as the diaphragm itself, and it lifts and closes just in that area. As I've said, it is a one-way valve, and its primary function is to allow flow this way only and not the other way, because if it started to go the opposite way, it would just close that valve flap and stop flow. So it goes through this way only. But at this point the primer bulb's still rising, so we've got suction pressure coming down this pipe here, and it's that suction pressure that's lifted this valve flap off its seat and allowed flow through, and of course it continues down then the regular path we've just mentioned. Going further now, that vacuum has felt right back here. It's all the same tube and it's felt right back to this point, and air is sucked out of this area here. This is the fuel pump reservoir. And the real function of this area will become apparent shortly. But for now, if we notice, we've got two pipes. We've got one that we've just seen coming in, and we've got this one here. And of course, suction pressure is felt here as well. And of course, air starts to come down here and fill the fuel pump reservoir behind it. So air is drawn down this tube here, and there's a special opening there that's open all the time. I know the gasket shows that it isn't, but there is a special opening there. And you can see by the little dotted lines, that's what I've illustrated it as. So there's a hole there and it travels down, the air travels down, and it leaves this area here, the upper area. And that of course creates a further vacuum in this upper area here. And it's this vacuum that lifts another little valve flap off its seat there, and the vacuum can be felt now underneath. This of course allows air to come underneath it. Again, this is a one-way valve, so it lets air this way, and it enters this upper cavity here on its way round the system. And now that valve flap's open and we've got vacuum. That vacuum can be felt all down this fuel line here, or fuel vein as we sometimes call it. And it's felt right back up here to another special opening, and this is again another opening that's open all of the time. I couldn't show it because of the gasket, but I've put some little dotted lines there to show that this is a constant hole. So it travels down there, and as it does so, it continues that vacuum pressure up here in this little chamber. We'll just zoom out again so we can see a little clearer. And that vacuum there is felt beneath here, because again there's a direct hole in the diaphragm allowing for this. And if we take a closer look there, we'll see that this here is what we call a strainer filter. This strains fuel as it comes into the carburetor, and they can be cleaned or they can be replaced. So from this area then, we've got a direct hole through the gasket and through the diaphragm, and then all of that vacuum can be felt all the way up this fuel tube, so it sucks upwards. And just to illustrate, of course, this is where the fuel pipe from the fuel tank is fitted. And with this fitted, a result of all that vacuum pressure means that we're going to draw some fuel up into this pipe from the fuel tank. And as long as the primer bulb itself is drawing back out and to its original shape and causing a vacuum, then fuel will be drawn up and there'll be a vacuum all inside these areas we've just shown. Because ultimately that air just wants to come down these pipes and end up inside the primer bulb itself, because it's the primer bulb that's sucking it in. It's worth noting at this stage that the vacuum pressure comes down the side channels here. So it doesn't come through the middle there, because through the middle is where we actually expel the air. It actually comes down the sides here on the outer part. So it comes back through into a different compartment. So everything's been drawn through as a result of the primer bulb opening, and now it's open to its full extent. We take a look inside now, everything is still. The wing areas on this special rubber valve have now returned to their seat, so there's nothing coming underneath them. It's just their normal natural springiness and their rubber that allow them to return to the seat. And of course that's the reason they've returned to the seat, because there's nothing pushing them open. To be specific, there isn't two rubber flaps here at all. This is just a cross-sectional view of one whole rubber valve flap, if you like. But if we notice at this point, there's nothing moving. Inside the carburetor here, in the fuel bulb and in all of these areas within the carb, there's air in there, but none of the air is moving in any direction. Now if we notice here, we've still got fuel in the fuel pipe and it hasn't actually leaked back towards the tank. And the reason for that is, for this little valve flap here, we saw earlier what this valve flap does and we saw air coming underneath it. But essentially what it's done is it's gone back onto its seat and it's separated this compartment here in the upper area from the fuel line below. And that's because this fuel here, still in the fuel line, would ideally like to naturally fall back to the tank under atmospheric pressure. So as the weight of this naturally pulls back towards the tank, it creates a vacuum of its own in these pipes here, all along these fuel lines. And it's only a very small vacuum it creates, but it's enough to pull down on this valve flap here and put it fast on its seat to stop any flow going back through it. And that's great news because we don't want to lose that fuel back to tank, because next time we press the primer bulb we want to pull that fuel up further, and there's no way we could do so if we keep losing it back to the tank. As we know, there's also a valve flap there, and that's naturally at this point resting on its seat. So as it stands, both valve flaps are now in the down position on their seat. And that completes one push of the primer bulb, and now we're going to push it again. So let's press the bulb in again, and as you can see we've got the air escaping through the centre there, and that really is the only way the air can go, because it can't go past these flaps here, because when we press down and force that air upwards, the air acted on those flaps there, so it acted on that special valve and pushed it further on its seat, so there's no way it could go back up through these fuel lines and into the metering area, so it can only go out and back towards the fuel tank. So it's worth noting at this point that the only area of movement is the return system. The other areas of the carburetor are perfectly still. Okay, the bulb's been pressed in, of course, so let's now release and let the bulb expand back to its original state, and now we can see the changes occurring again inside the carb. And the one noticeable thing now is the change in flow. We've got air coming down into the primer bulb now because the primer bulb's expanding and sucking down on that air, so it's creating the vacuum back along these pipes in the metering system, and it's all the way up here, it's felt all the way up to the top, and also of course it's felt here in the fuel pump reservoir, and it opens the valve flaps so that air can come underneath it, as we explained earlier. So now we've got this vacuum pressure felt here, and a result of having all this vacuum pressure here now is that it's drawn this fuel up a little bit further, and that's exactly what we need it to do. Okay, so as the bulb cycles right back, it draws that fuel up a little bit more, and of course that's the second time we press the bulb, and of course now we need to press it again. And just like before, the air pressure has pushed the rubber valve fast on its seat, stopping the air pressure from going up this way and into the metering area, and so it can only go one way again, and that's through the centre because we forced through that one-way valve, and out through the return system again. Everything else in the carburetor, as before, is still. Okay, at this point now we'll release the bulb yet again, and it will draw back just like it did before. The one-way valve in the centre will close, stopping any air coming in through the return, and airflow will flow down and into the bulb as it did before, coming out of the metering area. And so when the bulb is fully open again, we can see that fuel has been drawn in even further. And again, fuel's kept in this line here, and it doesn't leak back towards tank, remember, because this diaphragm here, the little flap on the diaphragm, is held fast on its seat, preventing it from flowing backward. And now we'll press the primer bulb yet again, and again we've got the air forced out through the centre there, through that centre one-way valve, out and into the return. Okay, releasing the bulb again, and it's drawing back, and it's drawn fuel now into all these compartments and all these fuel lines, so it's drawing it further into the carburetor. And as always, by the time the bulb is drawn right back, it's brought that fuel in even further. As I've said before, none of this fuel can leak back because these two diaphragm flaps here are fast on their seat at this stage. Okay, pressing the bulb again, and that air again forced out into the return. And what we can see now is that fuel is starting to come into that needle valve area. So it's no longer air coming through, it's fuel, and it's traveling down alongside the needle valve within that channel that the needle valve operates up and down within. And it's being sucked that way because of the air that's leaving the metering area and going to the primer bulb. And remember, it's that air leaving the metering system that's drawing up on this diaphragm here, keeping the lever at the back pushed down, and of course pushed up at the front as a result, and opening the gap there, allowing the fuel in, which will then quickly be drawn this way in following the air leaving this area. Okay, so as the primer bulb continues to open out and draw back, we've got fuel now all inside this metering system here. And what I should have mentioned earlier is that this is the main jet, and fuel travels up this area into the venturi. And what there is just there at the tip of the arrow is there's a special valve that doesn't allow any leak upwards until the engine has started, until we've got a vacuum up above there from air rushing into the engine. So fuel doesn't actually go this way at the moment. And of course it was the same story when this area was filled with air. It couldn't go back up this way. Okay, so the primer bulb's fully extended back now, and we can see there it's brought in a lot more fuel, and it's brought it right down into this line here, which is almost at the primer bulb itself. But at the moment the primer bulb is still full of air, but if we press it once more, and then when we release, we can see now that it's starting to draw in that fuel. It's being drawn down the special inlet channels here, and it's coming down here under the special one-way rubber valve. It's lifting that off its seat and seeping through. And now what we have is, as long as that bulb is drawing back now and going back towards its original shape, it will be drawing up in all of these areas and keeping that vacuum, allowing fuel to come directly now from the fuel tank all the way through the carburetor and start to fill that bulb. And at this stage, the bulb will be opening slower because now it's drawing in a liquid rather than air. And as we know, no air will be drawn into here to mix with this fuel, because we don't want that, because we've got the one-way valve in the middle there stopping any air coming back in from the return, and it's the suction pressure that's pushing that valve together even harder, so nothing will come through that way. So when the bulbs come right back, we can see we've got some fuel in there now, and we've maintained all the pressure above so nothing can leak back above. And now we can push the primer bulb again, and this time we're forcing out fuel. There is air being forced out in front of it, the rest of the air that was in the primer bulb, but the fuel now is going through the center valve there, the center one-way valve, and that's now heading towards the return. Okay, so we've released the primer bulb again now, and it's drawing in fuel here in the inlet, and fuel is coming in down this inlet channel here into the primer bulb. So now as the primer bulb expands and draws back, we're just seeing this steady flow now all the way through the carburetor and down into the bulb. A complete flow now of fuel all the way from the tank. So now when the primer bulb is fully extended back, we can see there that there's no air whatsoever in the primer bulb because we got rid of it all earlier. And all the way through the carburetor now, from the inlet from the fuel tank all the way through the center of the carb and down to the bulb, it's all just fuel. And now when we press the primer bulb, we're forcing out fuel. It's just fuel now going out into the return, and that fuel has pushed out that last bit of air that was in the return, and now we've got fuel now going through to the return fuel tank area. So what we're doing now when we push the primer bulb and release it, we're just having fuel cycling through from the inlet side of the fuel tank and out to the return. So we could say now that this carburetor is considered primed. Okay, now we know how a primer bulb system works. So let's see now how that all fits in with the bigger picture of how the carburetor works as a whole. We've got it all nice and primed up there, ready to start. And now let's have a look at the throttle and how that works. This is the throttle cable, of course, and it's attached onto the throttle lever here. So when the operator presses the throttle trigger, that then tensions this throttle cable, of course, which moves the throttle lever and rotates this barrel beneath, revealing this hole. And obviously, being the throttle, this regulates how fast or slow the engine will run. When it's open full like this, it's open to maximum airflow going into the engine, and so engine revs will be at maximum. And this particular type of carburetor has a unique structure in there, and it's one that a conventional type of carburetor doesn't have quite the same. This is actually part of the main jet that feeds the engine with fuel, and we'll just take a closer look. And in taking a closer look, the first thing we'll notice there, we've got like a plunger or a rod. And that plunger is directly connected to this upper part of the throttle mechanism here. And we can see that that rod is centered inside a tube area there. This is the main jet, and it extends right down through the center of the carburetor, right down into the metering area there. And if we take a look there, there's that special valve I was talking about that won't allow any fuel upwards in towards the venturi or the inlet of the carburetor until the engine has started. We'll take a look a little closer again, and if we look there we can see what appears to be like a little seat for the plunger to sit into. So the end of the plunger here is of the same shape of this seat, and at the moment it's in the open position. But when the throttle trigger is released and this throttle barrel here is rotated into its closed position, imagining we could see through there with X-ray vision, we'd see that the plunger is fast onto its seat. And so when the carburetor's resting and not operating, this is the position the plunger will be in. It'll be sitting in its seat like that. And the way it's moved off its seat is by way of moving the throttle lever. When we press the trigger and the throttle lever moves, the special design in the throttle mechanism makes it so that the throttle lever and the throttle barrel rise upwards as it rotates open. And of course, because that plunger is also directly connected to the throttle barrel, it rises up with it, lifting the point off its seat. So let's imagine then that this carburetor is fixed to a machine and we've just primed it up and we're going to try and start the machine. So then we can see just how the carburetor works. And just for illustration purposes and to make things a little simpler, let's open the throttle wide as we can. Because of course we don't have to always do that when we start a machine, sometimes we only need it partially open. So the throttle is now set, and let's now imagine that the operator has pulled the starter pull cord, and so the engine started turning over. It's now cranking, and that's drawing in air through here, through the inlet. So that's got the ball rolling, and we can see there that the air is travelling through there nicely towards the engine. And because the throttle's wide open and this plunger is nicely off its seat, the air rushing in towards the engine is drawing here. It's drawing air out of the pipe here and drawing it from down below. So what it's doing is it's creating a vacuum, and that vacuum is drawing on this fuel here down below. And that vacuum overcomes that special valve and allows fuel to flow upwards through the main jet here, through this pipe. And it's released here out into the venturi where the air takes it through into the engine for combustion. So the engine's now fired up and there's a constant supply of air going into the engine now that the engine's pulling through the venturi, and that's dragging out there, creating that vacuum and dragging out all of that fuel from right down this main jet here and into the center of the carburetor. So the venturi has now begun receiving a supply of fuel from the metering area here. So as the air rushing through the venturi continues to draw out that fuel there from the main jet, it has an effect down here in the metering system. Because it's supplying the venturi with fuel, it's creating a vacuum down here, and that of course affects the metering diaphragm. It of course draws the metering diaphragm upwards. And if we take a look at that a little closer, we can see there now that the diaphragm has been drawn upwards, and that's had an effect on the back of the lever there, on the back of the metering lever of course. And again that lever is tilted here, and the vacuum strength of all that fuel leaving into the venturi has overcome the power of this spring here, and it's tilted forward at the front here. And that's opened the tip of the needle valve again, and it's created a vacuum in this upper chamber here, lifting that valve flap here off its seat. And of course then it draws fuel in from the system, and then all that fuel then travels down past the needle valve here and into the metering area where it can be taken up the main jet here, making it available for the venturi there, for the inlet of the carburetor. And now there's a constant supply of fuel coming through the carburetor, providing the engine's running and the throttle's open, then the through road of fuel will just continue this way now, as it is, right round the system and up through the main jet and into the venturi. So whilst we're running, there's a vacuum pressure in here in the metering area, and we might say, Well, if there's a vacuum in here, why does it not draw out of this pipe here and draw fuel out of the primer bulb? Well, that's where our special little rubber valve comes in again. And if we notice, that special rubber valve is sitting nice and firm here onto the carb body, so it's sitting onto its seat well. And that's because the pressure above, the vacuum pressure, is drawing upwards, of course. So it's sucking that special valve onto its seat even harder, so it's creating a brilliant seal. And that means, of course, absolutely no fuel whatsoever can be lost out of the primer bulb to the metering area. One thing I need to mention at this stage is that although fuel is being drawn out of this area, of the metering area here, and up through the main jet and out into the venturi, and it's the air that's rushing past the end of the jet that draws it out, it isn't the only pressure that helps that fuel come out the main jet. It actually gets some help, and we get that from this diaphragm here. This is the fuel pump diaphragm. The diaphragm spans right across the width of the carburetor, but the fuel pump part of the diaphragm is this area here. Now, this is a specific area of the diaphragm that's compartmentalized by the special gasket above, and it moves up and down like a pumping action. Of course, in a real life situation, it would move up and down much faster than this. In fact, it moves as fast as the piston moves up and down inside the engine, and I'll explain how that comes about shortly. But each time that fuel pump diaphragm lowers, it pushes out fuel out of that fuel pump reservoir into this area here, into this fuel vein. And then it continues along and helps push that valve flap off its seat, that one-way valve flap. And then it enters this upper chamber here and then is forced down past the needle valve, because at this stage the needle valve's open because of that vacuum drawing out into the venturi. And now it's a double whammy effect. We've got air rushing through the venturi, sucking that fuel out of the main jet, and we've got the pump there creating pressure inside the metering area there, allowing the fuel to go upwards in towards the venturi much quicker and better. And the obvious result of all this is that the engine's running much better and much smoother because it's got a great supply of fuel there. And the way the fuel pump actually pumps and gets its power to pump is a lot to do with this area here. This is a special hole on the side of the carburetor, and it has a special airway there that extends inside the carb to the top of the fuel pump diaphragm. And if we just put that into perspective, it's this hole here I'm referring to. And just to explain how all of this works, we'll come back to the diagram. And if we could imagine now that this carburetor is fixed to a machine, so it's bolted to a machine, that hole there would be connected to the engine by a special airway or a pipe. And let's take a basic look how. So we've got the carburetor here, and let's imagine we've got an engine here. Of course, they're not to scale, I'm just making a point. And we've got the connection there, as we can see at the bottom of the engine, we've got that connection of that pipe there to that little hole. And in reality, the carburetor would be fitted to the side of the engine, of course, but we've got a direct contact now from that hole to the bottom here, underneath the piston. And of course, we've got the crankshaft here, and when that turns and the piston lowers, we can see there that the piston traveling downwards is forcing pressure through that pipe and into that hole in the carburetor. So that pressure is coming up to the carburetor through this line here, what we've just seen, and it's going inside the hole, and then it's going down into its special airway inside the carburetor, and it ends up here on top of the diaphragm. And this area of the diaphragm is specially compartmentalized. As we said before, it's that special gasket above that compartmentalizes all of the air to the top of this diaphragm, which forces it downwards. Okay, so that's the state of the diaphragm when the piston has lowered, creating a pushing action above it. But now the piston rises, and we can see there's a different direction and flow, because as the piston rose, it created a vacuum behind it, and that caused a drawing out action. So it's like a sucking action. And of course, that vacuum has felt all the way down this pipe and through this hole. And of course, that'll have an effect inside the carb, because now all the air that was on top of the diaphragm now wants to come out under the piston. So what's happening now? Now that air is leaving the top of the diaphragm, it actually draws the diaphragm up, because it's that vacuum effect. So it draws that diaphragm upwards as the piston rises. Then, of course, the piston lowers and creates a pressure inwards and pushes the diaphragm down. and then it rises again and draws out there, creating a vacuum, lifting the diaphragm again. And that's the continual cycle. That's why I mentioned earlier that the diaphragm travels at the same speed as the piston travels up and down. For this illustration, and just to make things a little easier, I've shown a constant supply of air and fuel there in the venturi going into the engine, when in reality that would only be the case when the piston lowers, drawing in the air and fuel. Of course, when the piston rises, there'd be a momentary stop of air going into the engine, and then it would start again when the piston lowers. But this air being drawn in and out of this airline here shouldn't be confused with the air going in through the inlet. They're two separate systems. So just a quick recap, we've got air from the piston creating a pressure and a vacuum on this diaphragm here, making it pump up and down quite efficiently, and it's pushing fuel this way under the one-way valve flap, and it's going down past the needle valve into the metering area. Then it's going up through the main jet, because now we've got extra vacuum there because of the drawing in of the air above it, and it's sucking it all out there into the venturi. And what we've got now there in the venturi is a nice mix of air and fuel, so it's nice atomized fuel ready to be combusted in the engine. The pressurized fuel from the fuel pump reservoir, when the fuel pump's pumping by the way, can only go down this fuel line and up through this valve flap and down into the needle valve, rather than take this fuel vein, which is the inlet, which would actually go against the inlet flow. And the reason it doesn't go down this line here is because when the fuel pump lowers, it does create a pressure in this line back here and into this chamber, and it creates it right back to this valve flap here. This is the one-way valve flap. And this valve flap, when this pressure above here, is pushed down fast on its seat, so no pressure can go below it, and it can't travel down the inlet. So it can't travel this way, it can only travel this way. And so far I've only explained how this pump pushes out fuel for the metering area in order to be used in the engine. I haven't actually shown yet how it draws fuel in, and of course it has to draw fuel in order for it to push fuel out, because that's the working of a pump, to create flow. So I haven't actually shown how it's creating flow yet from the tank through the system and then return to the tank. So let me just explain. So as the fuel pump diaphragm raises and lowers, then as it lowers it creates a positive flow pressure for the fuel underneath it, and as it rises it creates a vacuum for the fuel, so it sucks fuel in. So just for illustration purposes, let's imagine that the diaphragm is just in its downward position. So we've got a snapshot there of it in its downward position, because the air pressure is pushing down on the back of it, on the top of it, pushing it down. And then obviously we've got movement in the piston, so the piston goes up and it pulls the diaphragm up. As it's pulled that diaphragm up, it's going to want to draw in fuel into that area, because it's just expelled fuel out, so it's going to want to draw more in. And it can draw from these two lines here, but we only want it to draw from one of them. This line here is the outlet line, so we don't want it to draw back through there, because if we drew from there the engine wouldn't run, because it would be constantly drawing back on that fuel that should be going down to the metering area. But the clever thing about this fuel line is that when the diaphragm draws in from this line and tries to draw in the fuel, it actually has an effect here on the one-way valve. The vacuum there going inward towards the diaphragm pulls that one-way valve onto its seat tightly, so that no fuel can now escape from this line back into this reservoir. Okay, so the diaphragm goes back up again, and we can't draw from this line, we've already established that, so we draw down here from this line. And of course when we do so, the vacuum pressure is felt all the way up here into this chamber, and because we've got vacuum up here, it lifts this valve flap off its seat. It lifts it up. And of course now that valve is off its seat, the fuel from below can now travel upwards past it, and that vacuum can be felt all the way down these fuel lines here and up into this chamber, and it passes that metal strainer filter there, which is doing its part in helping to clear the fuel of debris. And we can see from here that there is a direct inlet from the fuel tank through the system and into the fuel pump reservoir, all as a result of that diaphragm lifting upwards, creating that vacuum. Okay, so the piston's come back down now, and that will have lowered the diaphragm. So let's have a better look at the fuel flow when the diaphragm's in its low position. Okay, so that air pressure above has pushed the diaphragm down, and when it came down, it forced that fuel outwards through this point here, and we can see by the direction of the arrows the way it's taken. So first of all, importantly, it tried to take this route, but it couldn't go any further than this point here. It went to this chamber and then it forced the valve flap onto its seat and couldn't go any further. So indeed, it went the correct way. It came down the outlet fuel vein here. It lifted this valve flap off its seat and then travelled past it. And then it went to the needle valve because the needle valve was open. It travelled down the needle valve. It entered the metering area. Then it went up through the main jet, travelled right the way up and out to the venturi. I'm just trying to simplify this system. It probably wouldn't pump just on one single downward movement of the pump from the pump all the way around the system and up to the venturi. It would probably take a few pumps, but I'm just trying to simplify the drawing this way. Okay, so let's have a look from this perspective when the diaphragm's gone back up. So there it is, the diaphragm's gone back up because the air above it has created a vacuum drawing it up, and that's of course drawn fuel in underneath the diaphragm. And we can clearly see the path now from the fuel tank going all the way through the system and down into the reservoir of the fuel pump. So as I've said, the diaphragm would travel up and down much faster than this, but this is something like what it would look like with the fuel flow. And one thing I need to mention now is there's only a certain amount of fuel that will be used up here in the venturi for the engine. And at the same time, this fuel pump is quite efficient at delivering fuel all the way down the system to the metering area to be used up there in the venturi. So the problem there is that this fuel pump is delivering more fuel down into the metering area there than what is actually needed for the engine quite often. So there has to be a relief system there to allow that pressure to be relieved. Otherwise, too much fuel would go up through the jets and into the venturi and it would flood the engine. So that pressure built up there then has to go somewhere. And where it goes is through this pipe here. This goes down towards the primer bulb, of course, but it travels down this pipe here and then comes out here on that special little rubber valve flap. And the pressure of the fuel, of course, comes underneath that valve flap there. It comes underneath, it forces it off its seat, and it fills the primer bulb here below. And the pressure builds up here in the primer bulb and then forces itself through the center there. And it opens that one-way valve, and then it follows the route there through that fuel vein out through the return, right back to the fuel tank. So finally, let's take a look at how we adjust these carburetors in order to make the engine run right. So how we adjust this screw here. This is a single screw adjustment. On conventional carburetors, we normally have two, a H and an L for the high and the low. And I do already have videos on how to adjust the two screw adjustments like this, so please take a look at that if you need to see that. They are already uploaded here onto my channel, so please do take a look. If you take a little search through, you should find them easy enough. But let's get back to our single point adjuster. And if we take a look at the screw there, we can see that it extends right through inside the car body and it terminates there on the jet. Of course, this screw is adjustable, and any turning of this screw clockwise would mean that the screw would screw in and protrude into the main jet. And of course, when the engine's running, we need a constant supply of fuel coming past here in order to go up into the venturi. So let's concentrate on this area a little more. And we can see there that the end of the screw is just meeting the main jet. And so now, if we turn this screw clockwise, and it all moves inwards, it will protrude in further into the main jet. It won't actually stop the fuel at this point, but it'll just restrict it, allowing less to go up into the venturi. And of course, if less has gone up into the venturi, and let's imagine we've screwed this screw in too far, then there'll be too little fuel going up there for the engine, of course, and of course it won't be able to combust properly. So engine revs will actually come down because we've got too little fuel going in. So as I've showed there in the center of the venturi, we've got less fuel going in and less air now because the engine isn't revving so high, it's revving very low, so there's less air coming through. And this is the state that we refer to as being too lean, because what we're trying to say when we say the engine's running too lean is that there is too little fuel going up into the engine. It's lean of fuel, and this is the problem it causes. And generally the symptoms of too little fuel going up into the engine is that sort of bogged down sound, that oh. It's like a lean sound. It's lean of fuel. There's air going in there so much, but we've got too little fuel. Now let's see what happens when we go the other way. Let's see what happens when we screw this screw out way too far, allowing too much fuel up. Okay, so we've screwed this screw anti-clockwise now, and it's screwed outwards. And as you can see, it's not protruding into the main jet at all, and it's offering no restriction whatsoever of that fuel going up into the venturi. And because we've got too much fuel going up there and the engine's drawing in too much fuel, it's actually flooding the engine, and we've got a similar problem with airflow here going in. Because it's flooding the engine isn't working very efficiently, and so engine revs are coming down, and so there's less airflow coming in through the venturi. And when we refer to flooding, of course, all that we mean is that we've got too much fuel going into the engine now, and it's flooding the engine with all that fuel. And generally, it means having to remove that fuel before we can ever get the engine running again properly. Generally, we can take the spark plug out and turn the engine over a few times, and that can get rid of some of that fuel, enough to start the engine again. And then, of course, we need to clean the spark plug, dry the spark plug off. And now let's go through a scenario where we've got this mixture screw set in just right. So it's protruding into the main jet perfectly. It's restricting it just enough, but not too much, to allow the right amount of fuel to go up the main jet and out into the venturi there. And you can see there we've got a nice mix of air to fuel, a nice ratio of the two, which is perfect for combustion. So we've got that air and fuel there together, and it's made that fuel nice and atomized so that the engine can combust it. And we've got maximum airflow now going through the venturi, as we can see there, and everything's running efficiently. Okay, so we now know that this is the mixture screw and it's a single adjustment, and we know how that works. This one above is referred to as the idling screw, or sometimes the tick over screw. And of course this screw sets the idling speed, and the way it does that on this particular carburetor is that this throttle barrel is allowed to rotate back towards its original closed position. And when the throttle trigger is released, this cable is relaxed, and that allows the throttle barrel to rotate back towards this way, because it's on a spring and it wants to spring back this way, and it's pressing the trigger on the throttle, which overcomes that spring. So releasing the trigger allows it to come back to its original state. And of course, because the throttle lever above here is attached to the throttle barrel, that rotates back with it. And it's the back of the throttle lever which contacts the end point of that idler screw. And because the back of the throttle lever is resting on the point of that idling screw now can be used to adjust the idling speed. And so if we were to turn that idling screw now clockwise, pushing it inwards, it would push against the throttle lever, turning the throttle barrel and opening the throttle, and that would increase the idling speed revs. And if we were to turn it anti-clockwise, then the barrel would spin backwards again, because it's on a spring, so it would close that airway and then it would reduce the idling speed revs.